Today, we have a great guest, Mr. David Sanger. Thank you, David, for your participation to this program, all the way from New York to Tokyo, which we have now cherry blossoms. David is a very well-known, prominent, leading journalist. He is a national security correspondent for the New York Times, three-time Pulitzer Prize winner, best-selling author of several books, including Confront and Conceal, and The Perfect Weapon. He's also a senior fellow at Harvard Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and also is a national, a CNN contributor. He's one of the most brilliant analysts of geopolitics, globalization, and cyber power. The topic of his lecture today is The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, which is also a title of his new book. I have not finished reading his book, but I have already been convinced that his new book is very interesting, and it is the most comprehensive and accessible histories of cyber war to date, with the strategic implications and consequences of this modern arms race. So that's brilliant. If this adjective is not appropriate, maybe you might have more adjectives such as savvy, insightful, incisive. So it is a great pleasure for me, with many audience here today, to listen to the author of this great book. When public awareness about cyber weapon or cyber war is increasing, even in Japan. So now, the floor is yours, David.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for all coming here today. It's wonderful to be back on the Todai campus. Only at Todai could an American author come in and give a talk completely in English and not feel too terrible about it. But my Japanese was poor when I left here 25 years ago, and you can imagine how much worse it's gotten since. So, but it's great to be back in a Todai classroom, and particularly to see so many old friends who have come out here today. So let me tell you a little bit about The Perfect Weapon and why I wrote it, and we'll see what we can do to get the slides up and running. That's the cover in English. It will be out in Japanese in about a month and a half from Asahi Press. The book came out in June of last year in the United States. And it's an effort to try to explain the geopolitics of cyber. There have been a lot of books that have been written about how to go protect your networks and what kind of software to get, and analyzing the code that went into Stuxnet, which of course was the attack, the American and Israeli attack on the Iranian facilities at Natanz, and we'll get into that in a moment. But I felt that there hadn't been much written about how cyber was fundamentally changing the way the United States and its allies were in competition each day with their adversaries, and how countries around the world, but particularly four, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, were using cyber as a way to undercut and seek advantage over their adversaries. And so this is very much a geopolitical history of what is happening in the cyber world. It's not the book to go to for an understanding of how to go protect yourself or what the code looks like. There are lots of books like that for the specialists. But instead, I wanted to do something more akin to what we saw happen in the late 1950s, when you saw a number of authors try to explain to American and then global public how nuclear weapons were changing the way countries used their power. And in fact, before I wrote this, I was reading Henry Kissinger's Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, a book that came out in 1957, and was in that group of books that first tried to explain this. That book is remembered in part for Kissinger's argument that you could actually conduct a limited nuclear war, an idea that he later walked away from. But I went to see him while I was working on this book. And in the course of our conversation, he said to me, you know, David, this is so much more complicated than what we had in the nuclear age, because at least in the nuclear age, we only had a small number of competitors and one that we cared about deeply, the Soviet Union. And we could design a defensive system that was built around the fact that we knew just where the weapons were coming from. And that, of course, is what ultimately gave growth to mutually assured destruction, a phrase that came out, and awful as it sounded and awful as it was, actually did manage to hold the peace for a while. What we've learned over the past few years is that while all the questions that come up in cyber are the same that come up in nuclear issues, all the answers are different. Mutually assured destruction doesn't work. Treaties do not work in this arena. There are too many players. And it's the perfect weapon because it is not only dirt cheap, but it's deniable. It's hard to figure out where it came from. And even if you figure that out, you may not know how to retaliate, because cyber weapons can be dialed up and dialed down to avoid triggering a military conflict. It's interesting to think that of all the cyber attacks that we have all read about over the course of the past few years, none of them have led the United States or any other country to bring about a military response. That's not accidental. It's because most countries have figured out this is an extremely useful short-of-war weapon, but you wouldn't want to use it in such a way that you would prompt an escalation to actual physical war. Now, that might happen at some point, but it hasn't happened yet, which is why I don't use the phrase cyber war very often. I use the phrase cyber conflict. And it takes many different forms. The one we've all been most focused on in recent times comes out of this room. This is in the basement of the Democratic National Committee in Washington, up on Capitol Hill. The old file cabinet that you see there on your left may be familiar to people of a certain age in the room, and you don't have to identify yourself, but you'd have to be old enough to remember Watergate, because that was one of the last remnants of the Watergate break-in. It's one of the file cabinets the Watergate burglars actually entered. You'll see the bottom file drawer has its handle broken off. That happened that night. And you'll remember that the Watergate burglars, when they got into this file cabinet room, ended up getting arrested because they had broken physically into the building. They had taped open the door. A guard found the taped door, called the police, and that was the beginning of the unraveling of the Nixon presidency. To the right of the file cabinet there, you see something that looks like an oversized laptop computer wrapped in some plastic. That is the server of the Democratic National Committee in 2016. It's the server the Russians broke into. Not just one Russian intelligence service, but two Russian intelligence services. In the summer of 2015, the SVR, a sort of successor to the KGB, broke in, but simply was doing reconnaissance work. About 8 months later, another Russian intelligence agency, the GRU, related to Russian military intelligence, broke in, and they're the ones who downloaded the documents that ultimately made them public that summer. Very different technique, something nobody had really expected the Russians would go do in the United States, even though they had done something very similar in the Ukraine just a year or two before. In this 40 years between the Watergate break-in and the 2016 election, cyber took off as a capability, mostly in the past 5 or 6 years, and became the primary weapon of choice for the likes of Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, and to many, the minds of many, the Chinese leadership, and certainly the Iranians. So what is this like, this strange weapon that you can use in so many different areas? There's no perfect analogy, but the one I like the most comes out of the beginning of air power. This picture here shows the Wright brothers demonstrating the military flyer in 1909 on what is now the soccer field of the University of Maryland at College Park, just north of Washington. The Wright brothers were showing off this plane because they were broke, and they needed to find a way to get the military to begin to buy the airplane. They were also trying to sell it to the French at the same time. What's fascinating when you read about these few days at College Park is that no one actually discussed arming the aircraft. They talked about flying it over enemy lines, coming back and reporting where the weaknesses in those lines were, and then sending in the cavalry. It's ridiculous when you think about how the airplane later got integrated in war. That beginning of integration did not happen for another 5 or 6 years. And in that regard, it's a little bit like cyber. When people started thinking about cyber, they thought about it in terms of surveillance. We opened mail, we tapped phones, we can use these kind of tools to break into communications and read them. Well, in the physical world, in the case of the airplane, that didn't last long. Within 10 years, less really, the Germans were already arming planes, and the Luftwaffe was created. There were some dogfights. But it's interesting to remember that the aircraft had no real strategic effect in World War I. The war would have turned out the same way with or without aircraft. There were some battles, there were a few deaths, but no big effect. That's about where we are with cyber right now. We're at about the end of World War I. We've seen the weapon used. We've seen it do a few things that made us lose our breath for a bit. We've seen it meddle in election, destroy centrifuges, but we haven't seen it with strategic effect. An interesting question is, how long will that moment last? In the aircraft arena, countries armed up quickly. The Japanese, of course, built the Zero. It was an extremely effective, inexpensive weapon. The Americans began building larger and larger planes. Here, of course, is the B-29, the Enola Gay. And then, of course, this was combined with another weapon, a terrible weapon that nobody could have imagined at the time the airplane was first invented. And so the airplane became the delivery device for a technology that had never even been invented at the time that the Wright brothers were showing off the plane to the military. That's got to make us a little bit humble. We know in cyber what the delivery mechanism is. We don't know what the actual weapon is going to look like 30 years from now. We have no idea. That should be no surprise because just 12 years ago, when the intelligence community brought out the Worldwide Threat Assessment, which is an annual exercise that Congress conducts, there was no mention of cyber anywhere in the assessment. This is just 2007. It's remarkable. It was 6 years after 9/11. The assessment began, terrorism remains the preeminent threat to the homeland. It's not that people in the US government weren't aware of cyber risk. Of course they were. But they didn't understand how to rank it. They didn't understand if it was a serious weapon or an annoyance. A few weeks after that came out, Steve Jobs introduced the first iPhone. If you pick one up today, it weighs what a brick would weigh. Looks pretty low tech compared to what we're used to. But it changed everything, because with the onset of mobile computing, you suddenly had a whole new set of targets for state sponsors of cyber attacks, for cyber criminals, for everyone else. If you could get into the endpoint device, then you could get into the network, because we were going to walk this device into our networks at the office, at the Pentagon, at the CIA, at the Japanese Parliament. You would be the one who would take the virus into the network environment. Now, Apple got its act together pretty quickly, and it became harder and harder to do that with an Apple device. But we now have an Internet of Things with millions, billions of devices, many of which are not very well protected, and which, of course, all create a new attack surface. So what's the world look like today? In the past 5 or 6 years, cyber has been the #1 threat in that worldwide threat assessment. One of them a few years ago said it soared in scale, sophistication, and severity of impact. And we no longer talk the way we did a few years ago about a cyber Pearl Harbor. You know, the big attack that takes out the electric grid from Boston to Washington or Seattle to Los Angeles. We simply don't discuss that anymore. We don't discuss it as much because we've been diverted by the Russia attack, but also because we're beginning to understand that that would not be a short of war attack. If anything, it would start a larger conflict if you took out that much electric power, and if it was attributed to a state. So instead, we're beginning to rethink the threat. That same threat assessment from about 2 years ago noted that all information communication technologies and IT networks will be perpetually at risk. The key word there, perpetually. What's that tell you? That we're not going to come up with a magic solution to this with new antivirus protections, with new kinds of endpoint protections. We're going to have to deal with it the way we deal with terrorism and climate change. A mix of cyber solutions and political solutions, which will, over time, have to end up combining just to mitigate the risk, but not to eliminate it. One of our bigger political problems, though, is we don't have a working concept of deterrence. We haven't managed to do what so many did by the late 1950s or early 1960s. So how is it that we're seeing nations using cyber? Well, clearly for espionage, we'll get back to that in a moment. Manipulation of data, that's our big fear. The deep fake of a politician who looks like he's talking about something he never talked about, getting into the military's databases and changing the blood types of every soldier or sailor, getting into financial data and changing that. Then, of course, there are attacks for destructive purposes, to do via cyber what previously you could only do by sending in a saboteur or bombing a site. We'll come to that in a moment. And then, of course, there's the political goals, achieving the political goals that we saw the Russians attempt in the 2016 election. I won't spend much time on espionage. On the left there is the F-15. On the right is the Chinese knockoff of it. The Chinese got into Lockheed Martin's files and managed to take that. The Chinese version costs about a third of what the American version does. Since our Japanese friends here are about to go buy 140 of these planes, you could ask the question, how much money could you save buying the stolen version from the Chinese? But I think you're unlikely to do that. There are many other examples, of course, of intellectual property theft, and we could spend the rest of the afternoon discussing those. More interesting to my mind is the use of cyber to actually go in and affect physical infrastructure, because that's the harder thing to do and the thing that states are most focused on these days. This picture, of course, is Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former president of Iran, walking through the centrifuge hall in Natanz. Those are centrifuges you see, the big silvery devices. They have a core in the middle that spins at supersonic speeds. You feed gas into it, uranium gas. It separates the heavier elements out to the bottom, the lighter elements to the top, and you purify the uranium. If you do it for a while and you get to 4% purity, you have the fuel for a nuclear power plant. If you just keep spinning it, just keep it going, then you have the fuel for a nuclear weapon. And that, of course, was our fear about what was happening in Natanz. President Bush was fearful that the Iranians were on their way to producing fuel for a nuclear weapon, but he couldn't publicly accuse them of that because he had just publicly accused the Iraqis of building a nuclear weapon, and that didn't work out so well. So instead, a group of intelligence officials and generals came to the Oval Office one day and said, Mr. President, we think we have another way to do this. We think we can get into what's called a SCADA system, the control system for this plant. And we think we can put malware into it that will speed up or slow down those centrifuges moving at their supersonic speeds until they get out of kilter and explode. And we knew this could happen because we've been building centrifuges in the United States since the 1940s, and we've blown up our fair share by accident. It's a big mess when they blow up. One of them blows up, it takes out several. It leaks radioactive uranium gas, mildly radioactive, out on the floor. It's a pretty messy cleanup. And the thought was this was a way to slow the Iranians down and force them, along with sanctions, to go to the negotiating table. Well, President Bush wasn't certain it would work, but he authorized them to try, and they went to Tennessee and took some centrifuges we had from Muammar Gaddafi's Libya and put them together and attacked them with software. And of course, over time, they learned how to make them blow up. They actually picked the shards up, flew them back to Washington, took them into the Situation Room in the White House, dumped them out on the conference room table, and invited President Bush to come down and take a look. And he uttered, when he saw it, what we carefully in the New York Times would call an earthy Texanism. But he basically approved their going out and trying to make this work in Iran, which is exactly what happened for the next 3 or 4 years, until one day the virus got out. It left the plant because of an accident in the way it was programmed. And it went all the way around the world. We had copies of it and the source code, along with many others. We broke that down and looked for the clues about where it came from. Ultimately, that resulted in this reporting. President Obama had inherited this plant and this program. It was one of the deepest secrets of the US government until they let the code get out by accident. And that, of course, led us to this coverage. Now, President Obama, when he approved the plan, or reapproved it, said to his staff, you know, The problem with this is that it's going to get out eventually, and when it does, every country that wants to attack the United States and its allies will use this as an excuse to do it. And that, of course, is exactly what happened. The Iranians went after Saudi Aramco. The North Koreans went after South Korea in an operation called Dark Soul that attacked financial institutions, media companies. The Russians began to go after the classified and unclassified email systems of the State Department, the White House, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Iranians, by the way, the Obama administration did not call out the Russians for this, didn't publicly name them, and I think later came to regret that after Putin saw that as an easy, clear way to go into the DNC. The Iranians went after the Sands Casino in Las Vegas. Can you imagine a nastier thing to do to a country than attack its casinos? They did that because Sheldon Adelson, who owns the Sands Casino, had suggested one day that the United States should drop a bomb in the Iranian desert and tell the Iranians if they didn't give up their nuclear weapons, they would be next. Well, he was caught on YouTube doing this. The Iranians saw it, said, Sheldon Adelson, desert. That guy's got some casinos, doesn't he? Be a shame if they walked in one day and turned on the casinos to operate and nothing happened because their hard drives were wiped clean, which is exactly what happened. The Russians went after a German steel mill, and then, of course, the North Koreans went after Sony, and the Chinese after the Office of Personnel Management. Now, this was the poster for the movie that prompted the Sony attack. How many of you here have actually seen the interview? Come on, admit it, if you have. There are a few hands up. Okay. For those of you who have not seen it, I can now save 2 hours of your life. It's got a great poster. It's a really awful movie. The idea was that Seth Rogen and James Franco play these two reporters who are sent off to go interview Kim Jong-un, and the CIA is supposed to hire them to assassinate him on the way out. And it's a comedy. It's a comedy because if you were going to hire some people as hitmen, I couldn't think of a worse group to do it from than my colleagues in the reporting business. But when the movie was announced, but before it came out, the North Koreans wrote a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations, and they asked him to stop the movie from coming out. I think they missed something about just how influential the Secretary General may be in Hollywood. But anyway, this didn't work. So the next thing they did was send out this guy with his team of young North Korean hackers to China, Thailand, Malaysia, and they began to write the code to get inside Sony's computer systems in the United States. They spent about 3 months in the system, mapping it out as patiently as we mapped out Natanz. They figured out how the computer system controlled the accounting system, the email system, the movie production system, the logistics system. Did the United States know that the North Koreans were inside Sony? Nope. Jim Clapper, the director of national intelligence, even went to North Korea while the attack was underway to get the release of an American. Here he is meeting the head of the Reconnaissance General Bureau, who was running the Sony attack. Not only did Clapper tell me later that he had no idea the attack was underway, but that the general took him out to dinner, lectured him about the Korean War, and stuck him with the bill for dinner. Pretty bad. Well, a few weeks later, after Clapper gets home, on November 24th, 2014, this is what Sony employees saw as they turned on their computers at work. It was a complete diversion. The smart ones reached behind their computer and unplugged them. That stopped the hard drives from erasing themselves. Most people didn't do that. And in about 2.5 minutes, Sony lost 70% of its computing power. Pretty remarkable for a bunch of sort of a pickup team of North Korean hackers. So then somebody had to go to the president and try to explain this. Was this an act of war? Well, let's face it, we're talking about Sony, a movie-making company. This isn't exactly critical infrastructure. Was it an act of digital vandalism, as Obama later called it? Well, certainly it was that, but maybe something more severe. Maybe it was true sabotage. The president was briefed on all this, not by these guys. This is a scene from the movie. I did find the actual briefer. This is what he said to me. He said he told Obama, "I never thought I'd be here briefing on a bad Seth Rogen movie, sir." Obama said, "How do you know it's a bad movie?" He said, "Sir, it's a Seth Rogen movie." Obama took about a month to figure out what to do, and just before he went on vacation in 2014, he came out to the press room and he said, "We can't have a society in which some dictator someplace can start imposing censorship here in the United States." That was interesting. He didn't say we can't have a society in which states attack our companies. He didn't say we can't have a society in which a state comes in and attacks a Japanese subsidiary company. And by the way, what's Japan going to do about this? He said we can't have them imposing censorship. He went on vacation, imposed some sanctions on the North Koreans that I doubt the North Koreans ever felt amid all the other sanctions that are on North Korea. And then he got the Chinese to turn off their internet for a day or two. It was interesting symbolic stuff, but it was pretty unsatisfying. The North Koreans had not really paid much of a price. It raises some interesting questions. Was this an act of war? If it wasn't critical infrastructure, should the US have been involved in defending it at all? Was that retaliation sufficient deterrent? At the same time, the Chinese were inside the most boring bureaucracy in Washington, the Office of Personnel Management. If you haven't heard of it, that's probably a good thing. They hold all the security files for everybody who's trying to get a security clearance in the US government. It's about 22 million files right now. The files were never encrypted. They were stored at the Interior Department because the Interior Department had extra computing space. The Chinese went in right after it, grabbed the files, encrypted them on the way out so we wouldn't see what was going on. I actually wrote later when OPM put out a contract to encrypt the files, why don't we just give the contract to the Chinese? They've already done the work. And the big question came up, what would the Chinese do with 22 million files? No one was quite certain of the answer. But it became clear over time that they were able to use big data techniques to go figure out who worked with whom on different projects. That you could go deep into the American system by figuring out who had been assigned to different places, who worked on the same projects. At the same time, the Chinese were into the Anthem insurance database. So they could combine the OPM data with people's medical histories. And we only learned a few months ago that they were into the Marriott hotel database. So you could figure out where all these people were traveling and with whom. That's a very different use of espionage. That's not just stealing the plans for an airplane. That's using it to weaponize it in different ways. Again, we couldn't figure out whether it was a cyber attack or not. The intelligence community in the United States didn't want to call it a cyber attack because we do the same thing to many other countries. So where are we on this? When Lieutenant General Paul Nakasone was nominated last year to run U.S. Cyber Command and the NSA, he was grilled on the question, do countries fear us? And he said, no, they don't fear us. And that's a key part of cyber deterrence, or the absence of it. We do know this problem's about to get worse. On the second bar from the right is the number of Internet of Things devices out in the market today, about 14 billion. End of 2020, we think that'll be over 20 billion. Some of them have quite good cybersecurity built into them. Some have almost none. That leaves the last category of cyber attack we've seen in recent times. And it's not really cyber attack at all. It is just the use of cyber to accelerate and to target specific messages. This is one of thousands that the Senate Intelligence Committee has put up on its website that were used just to divide Americans on sensitive issues. This was one about Black Lives Matter. Some were very partisan. This is one of my favorites. Satan, if I win, Clinton wins. Jesus, not if I can help it. That was pretty direct. Each of these was made to look like they were coming from your neighbor in the United States. Instead, of course, they were all being written in St. Petersburg, Russia, because they had studied our system and figured out that Facebook was a great vulnerability. They could go advertise and target this at specific groups in specific states. We don't know whether President Trump was aware of this or not. That's at the core of the Mueller investigation. But this is how the weapon was used. One of my favorites is one used in Texas called Get Ready to Secede. This was about pulling Texas out of the United States. I have a bunch of relatives in Texas from century and a half. Some of them I know would sign on to this. We might not invite them to Thanksgiving next year, but they certainly would have a right to put this on Facebook if they were Americans expressing their views. What Facebook's problem is figuring out who made the ad. They would allow it up if any of us put it on, but if it was ordered up by the Internet Research Agency on behalf of Vladimir Putin, they want to bring it down as inauthentic speech. So where does this leave us in the end? In the end, I think the problem that we're facing is that we don't have any common standards at this point about what we will and will not do in cyberspace. The United States doesn't want to create such standards because they don't want to limit an American president who might one day want to fix his own election or fix an election abroad, or might want to turn off the lights in a place like Tehran because it would be better than actually going to war with the Iranians. So we're not likely at the United States to lead the way in setting up a sort of digital Geneva Convention. In fact, so far, the US has voted against every effort to go do that. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't happen. And one of the things I hope that the book spears is a discussion about what's the appropriate and not appropriate use of cyber. That means cutting through a lot of classification, a lot of stuff that's overly secretive. Well, I'll leave it there and look forward to our conversation. And I thank you again for having me here back at Todai, and look forward to talking with all of you.